Keen, or Kian, I don't know, collects data about the number of people who own a smartphone and if they also own an MP3 player. Gives you the following information. 25 people surveyed own smartphones. 20 people that own a smartphone do not own an MP3 player. 9 people do not own smartphones, but they do own an MP3 player. And 24 people do not own an MP3 player. Design and complete a two-way frequency table. That's what we're going to do, and we're going to pretend like we're having so much fun. Well, this one didn't even label the boxes for us, and so we're going to have to do that for ourselves, which is okay, hopefully. You need a little bit of space there at the top. So just think about the two things we're comparing. You got MP3 players and smartphones, right? So, and of course there's lots of different ways to set this up, but we should have the first column and the top row be labels for the values we're going to put in this two-way table. And as we saw from the last two-way table, the bottom here should always be, oh, if I can spell total right, total. And the top right box should always be also a total value, okay? Because the bottom right box will always be the total of totals. If you put this anywhere else, it's going to look really jacked up. And, well, it may drive some people nuts, but whatever, okay? So you got two things. You got MP3 players and smartphones. So for me, I'm going to put MP3 players here. MP3s. Why did I put it there on the edge? Because they either own an MP3 player or they do not own an MP3 player. That's it. It's that simple, okay? So right here, I'm going to say own. And then the bottom one I'll say is not own. Could you put not own at the top? Of course you could. Why didn't I? I don't know. Just didn't. And then the other one was, well, we got smartphones, right? Smartphones here at the top. Well, for smartphones, you can either own one or you can not own one. Pretty clear cut. And this sets up the table so that we can start putting the values that they gave us into this table. For example, start with, they said 25 people surveyed owned smartphones. So smartphones owned, yeah, it has nothing to do with the MP3 players, just straight smartphones owned. That's a total right there. That'd be 25. Here. Oh, why didn't we put it here? Because, again, it didn't classify this with anything about the MP3 player. So let's go to the next point. 20 people that own smartphones do not own an MP3 player. So they own a smartphone. That's this one, this column right here. It says they do not own an MP3 player. That's this box right here because it's not own MP3 players. So for this one, that was 20 people's. So there's a 20 right there. Next up. 9 people do not own smartphones, but they do own an MP3 player. So it starts with smartphones here. It says they do not own it. That's this column. But they do own an MP3 player. So that's own an MP3 player here. That connects at this box here. And that was 9 people. So there's a 9er right there. And just so we understand, you could figure out how many people own a smartphone and own an MP3 player at this point, which you could do if you want, but I'm just going through the list first. It's up to you. Next up, it says 24 people do not own an MP3 player. Okay, use a different color here. So 24 people do not own an MP3 player. MP3 players, right here, it says do not own. That would be 24 people, so that'd be total. It didn't say anything about the smartphones here, so that'd be 24 right up in here. Well, is that enough information to find all the information? Of course it is. And that's what we're going to do next. So I'm going to start with the top left and then move right and then down. Okay? So that means I'm looking at this box right here. How can we find that value? Well, because we have 2 other values in the column. If you had 2 other values in the row, that would work as well. Okay, but I just have these 2 values in the column. There's a total amount of people that own a smartphone. That's 25. 20 of them do not own MP3 players, so I'm just going to subtract this out. And that gives me a total of 5 people that own a smartphone and own an MP3 player. So I'm moving right now. I'm staying on this row, which then brings me to this next box here. And that's the total number of people that own an MP3 player. So how many own MP3 players? With smartphones, they own smartphones, not own smartphones. So 5 and 9. I'm going to take those two values and just add them together. So 5 people own a smartphone while owning an MP3 player. 9 people own an MP3 player but do not own phones. It's going to add these two values. 5 plus 9 is 14. Boom. There we go. So next up for me is this box, because I'm just moving downwards and left to right. So this says it's not own a smartphone and also not own an MP3 player. So let's figure that out. And I'm just use the row again. There's 24 people that do not own MP3 players. 20 of those that do not own MP3 players own phones. So I'm going to subtract those 20, and that will tell me how many people then do not own smartphones as well. So that'd be 4. Now I can use straight addition to find these other totals because we have all of the values in other values in these columns. And so at the bottom here, for total people that do not own a smartphone, 9 of them owned an MP3 player, and 4 of them did not. So I'm just going to add those two values. 9 plus 4, boom, 13. And finally, the this is the total number of people surveyed. And there's 2 ways to do this. You should get the same value either way. I'm going to use the column first. So I see that 14 people owned an MP3 player and 24 did not. When I add these two numbers together, I get 38. It looks like they surveyed 38 people. But I should get the same value in the row as well, where it shows 25 people owned a smartphone, 13 did not, and when I add these two numbers together, it's the same exact 38, which it should be. And that's kind of the Sudoku thing about it. It should work both in the rows and the columns on this, okay?